We're so excited to have you here, ma'am.
Hmm, really? I hope I have answers. You guys have a lot of questions.
Yes, ma'am, we do. And we really believe that your insights would feed a lot to the students, especially because we're a student led organization. So it is truly an honor for you to be here. I think we can begin, guys. I just asked my team, ma'am. Okay. Can we begin, guys, with the recording? Okay. I just need a thumbs up from Kashish. Okay.
When do you hope to have this broadcast? I mean, put up or whatever?
Ma'am, it takes a little time to upload the video on Drive and then editing as well. So probably 3 to 4 days maximum.
Okay, 3 to 4. So
Yes.
this week or by weekend.
Yes,
Okay,
ma'am, by weekend. And then, ma'am, we can tag you on our Instagram and everything as well. So we'll do
sounds
that. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. So we'll begin now. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our podcast series, a segment under Global U Diplomacy Forum. Global U Diplomacy Forum is a non-profit foreign policy collective run by students of Gargi College, University of Delhi. We try to provide young college students a platform for us to make IR accessible, foreign policy accessible, and to critically engage with contemporary international issues through research, discussion, and other initiatives. Today, we're having a conversation that feels long overdue about India, the world, and in many ways in which global politics is quietly and not so quietly shifting under our feet. I am Christy, the president of the Global Youth Diplomacy Forum, and I'm joined by my vice president, Adiva, for this podcast. Adiva, you may take the floor.
Thank you so much, Christy. Joining us today is someone whose work many of us have turned to while trying to make sense of a world that often feels overwhelming and fast moving. Our guest for today is one of the most known voices in foreign affairs and journalism in India, Ms. Suhasini Haidar. Diplomatic editor at The Hindu, has spent years reporting on diplomacy, global conflicts, and India's foreign policy choices with clarity and nuance. From her earlier work at CNN IBN and CNN International to Worldview with Suhasini Haidar, she has consistently created space for serious and informed conversations on international politics. Her work has been recognized with several major journalism awards, and more importantly, it continues to shape how audiences understand the world beyond headlines. Ma'am, it's truly an honor for us to have you here today.
Thank you, Christy. Thank you, Adiva. It's an honor to be there. Sorry I'm not there in person, but hopefully we'll do that soon.
Thank you, ma'am, for joining us today. So, this is our first episode in our podcast series, and our theme for the episode is decoding India's way into a fragmented world order. Just to let our viewers know about a little bit about this theme, is that we would be examining how India is navigating this world order, which seemingly is marked by fragmentation, insecurity, and a lot of transactional diplomacy. And we'll be using key contemporary developments as our reference points. And we believe that this theme is very significant for India at a time of very shifting geopolitical transitions. We're witnessing regional conflicts, escalations, erosion, especially in the confidence of a rules-based order, and of course, a noticeable shift in transactional diplomacy, which can be seen in United States. And we believe multilateral mechanisms have appeared to be very strained, and power balances are increasingly being negotiated through selective partnerships. Against this backdrop, India's approach reflects a very measured but purposeful engagement with a multipolar world, and especially talking about its renewed strategic momentum with the European Union, its expanding outreach in West Asia, and other strategic alignments. Uh, Adiva, you may begin with the first question.
Thank you so much. So, without any further ado, let's begin today's podcast. Ma'am, as we know, there is this popular phrase in India, quest for a multipolar world, which has served as a shorthand for its effort to maintain productive relations with all major powers. Ever since the end of Cold War, which eventually meant carefully managing American primacy, cooperation with post-Soviet Russia, and engaging a rapidly rising China. Today, however, we see that the same strategy is being recalibrated, and we see that India's pursuit of multipolarity is running through Europe. So, we have also seen recent notable movement in India Europe ties, from renewed push on EU India FTA to President Emmanuel Macron's visit to India. Ma'am, but the EU India FTA negotiation took nearly 2 decades to gain momentum. Why does this why does this push seem to be coming together now? And what does it tell us about the changing strategic and economic priorities on both the sides?
Thanks so much. And it's an important question because everybody's sort of now talking about the India Europe equation. And it's primarily because what of the optics we've seen, Prime Minister Modi hosting the heads of the European Council and Commission, the presidents in Delhi, them coming for the Republic Day parade, the announcement of the EU India FTA. And as you said, uh, it was originally launched 20 years ago. So it's looking like a Europe India moment in a sense, and everyone's looking at what is driving it. The first thing I would say is we need to look at it in what's the immediate context, because as Christy mentioned, fragmentation of world order is a huge theme. But I want to make the point that we have to start at the very beginning. And by that, I mean the India's foreign policy principles right at the start, simply because those are the underpinnings of what we see today. Whether it has been right at the start when Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru said in the Constituent Assembly that the foreign policy of independent India would include, several tenets, but one of them was that he didn't call it non-alignment. He said no alignment with global powers in a sense. No one power we will be aligned to. Within 10, 15 years of that, the non-aligned movement came around. That kind of positioned India in the world. Subsequently, we have seen various words being used, different kind of ways of explaining the same thing: multi-alignment, multipolarity, strategic autonomy. What are we essentially saying? We're saying that India does not stand with any one global power. India will seek the foreign policy that maximizes its or hers, as they call it, its options in the world for the betterment of Indians. And while I know that there has been a constant sense of trying to see what are the changes in Indian foreign policy, what's happened, what used to happen 60 years ago, what was the policy before 2014, for example, it is necessary to see that whether you call it strategic autonomy or multipolarity, this is inherent in the Indian DNA. I'm happy to go into reasons for that, but basically, put this way, India has always stood out. The cheese stands alone, as they say, and India has always stood out, not in an exclusive way, not in an exclusivist way to say, I don't go with anybody else, but to say, I will try to maximize my friendships because I think it's important for the world to try and broaden the spaces of discussions and not get into one axis, one pole, one alliance, or one sphere of influence. So, in a sense, India has rejected the Cold War. India has rejected the G2. India has rejected the idea that you have to carve up the world, divide it, and you have to tell me which side of it you stand. Now, into all of this comes what you were asking about, which is the past year. And let's be clear, the change that we are seeing right now or talking about right now, it may have been coming for many years, many decades, but it has been crystallized by the moment of US President Donald Trump coming to his second tenure, because his first tenure saw shifts, saw changes, saw shocks, but not of the kind we're seeing right now. And so what we are seeing is essentially the reactions, the what the US's actions are, how the world is reacting to it, and is going around. But can I also take you back another 5 years? This is the 21st century. We're in the in the third decade of this, and the second half of the third decade of the 21st century. But think about what all of you have been through since 2020. And especially if you live in India, think of what everyone in India has been through since 2020. COVID pandemic, clear, real sort of erosion of a sense of security. The China-India standoff at the line of actual control in the middle of that COVID pandemic, how that changed India's idea of its geopolitical security, followed by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, energy security that got hit. Also, the idea that again you're being pulled to take a choice, you take a side between, say, Europe and the U.S. and Russia, which is a traditional friend. Then you come to the terror strike in Israel in 2023, followed by Israel's 2 year bombardment of Gaza. And you see the kind of international laws that were repeatedly thwarted during that time. And you realize that the world order is also, nobody's really respecting it, but also all of India's future planning, things like connectivity planning, that goes away. Then you've got President Trump coming to power. So we're talking about five different big shocks, apart from all the small things that happen, the daily announcements and all the rest. You have this situation where a US president comes to power. He says three things. It's not just about tariffs. He says, of course, he says on trade, there are no rules. I will decide what the tariffs are going to be depending on how I feel today. I can change my mind. I can slap a 25% tariff on you for something and put another 25% when we feel like. And suddenly, India, that has had this kind of security of its America relationship for at least 25 years, sees a US president essentially saying, it doesn't matter how close we are. I'm going to put you at the top of the countries in the world in terms of how much tariff he put on us. So 50% on India, only Brazil had the same amount. So that's one part of the shock of US President Trump coming to power. The second part of the shock is his desire to do away with many of the rules of sovereignty, territorial integrity when it comes to the US. So, when he talks about Greenland or when they have an operation in Venezuela, you're essentially seeing a US government saying the international rule of law that was set up in 1945, that India has been a beneficiary of, but has also been very importantly trying to hold up, that doesn't matter to us anymore. We'll bomb when we feel like it. The speech he gave just 2 days ago where he said, I can destroy an entire country, so I can't tariff them. That's the second part, that this very important idea of geopolitical sovereignty, territorial integrity has gone away. And the third part is the going away of the multilateral order. So a little bit of what you were asking, the idea that the UN and other multilateral institutions that were set up post 1945 just don't matter. If you saw that list of, I think, 60 odd international organizations that the US announced it was just withdrawing from, it means it takes time to build an institution. And here in one executive order, you just say the largest donor of the world, the country that used to be seen as a kind of guarantor of the world order, says, sorry, I'm getting out of this. So what you're seeing is, yes, between India and Europe, there's been a growing relationship. There has been absolutely, since 2006, they've been trying to get a trade deal together. It is also true that actually between 2013 and 2021, we didn't actually have too much by way of negotiations. They just paused, and in fact, they had to restart from scratch in 2022. So it's essentially 3 years or 4 years of negotiations that you're seeing. But they came to a point, as I said, that crystallization has come now because you're looking at all these shocks. You're looking at the withdrawals of all these international tenets and institutions, and you're saying there is a need for at least those in the room who believe in being responsible powers, who believe in stability as something that helps us. Because after all, when you're looking at the big powers, whether it's the US and what it's done, whether it's Russia and what it did with Ukraine, whether it's China and the consistent kind of worries about Chinese actions in the South China Sea, each of them are saying instability doesn't really bother us. This is the opposite of what we've seen in the past. In the past, the global leaders were the guarantors of stability, were pushing for stability. Now, when that goes away, what's next? For Europe, the kind of, the laundry list I just drew of the ways India was affected is double. Because unlike India, that I think sensibly chose not to be part of an alliance, Europe and the transatlantic alliance is the core of European security. And they're suddenly seeing that being questioned. So I think both for India and for the EU, the European Union, which of course is a grouping of 27 states, but there are 27 states that have decided that their foreign policy, their trade policies, and all will be negotiated together. They decided that this is the moment. It's not a moment of multipolarity or multi-alignment. It's a moment of preserving the options of multi-alignment and multipolarity.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your answer. I believe you've covered a lot, going over from the history and then how many the shocks that we as Indians have gone through, and especially this has been a situation where India, I'm pretty sure, have had a moment where it's like, okay, what now? Because as you said that the negotiators, the US especially, which was again the guarantor of world stability, just says I'm out of this. So it does come a shock to all of us, of course, and especially India. And ma'am, especially when we talk about Europe, it's also important to acknowledge the conflict that's still going on in Russia, Ukraine, and it's approaching its fourth year now. And we see that negotiations between Russia, Ukraine, and US, they are repeatedly becoming stalled, and there's not any meaningful breakthrough in sight. And at the same time, Europe is still extending its support to Ukraine. Do you believe that this lack of progress that we're seeing in these peace negotiations deal is definitely due to US's shifting priorities or strategic interest? Or is this deadlock, we believe, more structurally rooted, that there's still conflicting interests between Moscow and Kiev?
It's obviously a complex issue, or it wouldn't have gone on for 4 years. After all, when India Pakistan had a conflict last year, both were nuclear powers. But at the end of the day, the one thing nobody understands internationally, they get very worried about India and Pakistan conflict, is that they were able to stop it within 4 days. Right? They were able to say, let's move away from the conflict and now try and deal. Not that they're speaking to each other or anything, but at least they didn't continue that conflict. This is now 4 years, as you pointed out. In fact, today is, I think, the day, or tomorrow is, and you're essentially saying that that conflict, which polarized the world, that saw the Western world, in a sense, just pull away from Russia, economically, culturally, in terms of any kind of trade or other connections with Russia, cut off energy, cut off all the ties between them. And this conflict has gone for 4 years. So nothing that Europe actually did or the US actually did, even when the US and Europe were really working in tandem, has ensured that the war stops. In fact, we've just seen some more bombings in. Clearly, it is something that they have not been able to solve. Would they have resolved it had 2 years or 3 years ago, when there were talks in Turkey, in Istanbul, that seemed to be coming to some kind of conclusion, and at the last minute, Ukraine was told by the UK and Europe, don't accept a status quo kind of situation. Could that have been the easy answer? Obviously, it's for Ukraine to decide when they want to accept terms. But would it have been easier if they had done this right now? Is one way of looking at it. The other, should the US and Europe have armed Ukraine better? Was there a situation in which they could send troops in to counter Russia? I think both of these are difficult outcomes, and that's why we've not seen either of those outcomes play out. In fact, what we have seen play out is a day-by-day kind of solidifying of the status quo. I always point this statistic out, which is that in between February and March of 2022, so from the invasion, if you went for 1 month, Russia was able to occupy and control, they said, between 19 to 20% of Ukraine. If you looked 2 years later, when the war had really been at its peak, right now there's less conflict than there was before, although it's still continuing. But I'm talking about those first couple of years where you really saw daily, conflict and fighting. With all of that, maybe they were able to push Russia back 2%, 3%, even if you were to say from 20% to 15%. But at the end of the day, the bulk of the territory that Russia had sought to control, at least had taken in that first month, remains there. So the question is, are we going to look at what's called a line of control, a frozen conflict now? Where both sides agree to disagree on where the actual territorial boundaries lie, but they agree to stop the war. And I think that's where this is heading now, because I think it's become very clear that the thing that is needed is a ceasefire. This could have happened 2 years ago. It could have happened a year ago. There have been talks about this. At the end of the day, it is also about whether, having taken the positions that Europeans did, they are willing to, stop at this point and say, okay, well, Russia gets what it gets. I think there isn't an appetite in Europe for that. The third thing you're seeing, and I think this is what and if I'm sounding tentative, it's because it is hard to tell which way this will go. But the third thing people must remember is the push within Europe now to increase their own military budgets. So, Europe that post World War was actually working towards lower and lower 0.5% defense budgets, working on NATO security as the security for all of Europe, is now talking about between 2.5% to 5% of their GDPs being used for military purposes. At the same time, there's a real threat and a real worry they have that Russia will try to move further east. There's a constant concern in a lot of the European countries about this. And I think what we're going to see is a kind of maybe coming down of the actual conflict as I said, this frozen conflict begins to emerge as the only solution, but a spiraling of the suspicions. And therefore, any kind of ceasefire now becomes much more difficult to hold than it was in the past. I'm sorry to give you this very sort of grim prognosis of what you see there, but you're seeing within the actual moves for peace, and of course the US is quarterbacking talks, and Ukrainian Russian representative has been meeting first in UAE, now they'll meet in Switzerland. Even as those talks are going on, it remains to be seen whether, when they finish with the talks and come to some kind of conclusion, how will Europe respond to them? Because remember, Europe is being, in a sense, cut out of these talks right now. It's Russia, Ukraine, the US, and whichever place they are at. So I think it's going to be hard because we're sowing the seeds for the next round, if you like, of tensions.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for answering that. As you mentioned that it's high time for a ceasefire. It is much required as well. And but ma'am, there are certain contentions, especially US being uncertain in recent times. What if it backs out? That's a huge contention I feel for Europe and Ukraine as well. So what could be a more probable end to this conflict? Would it remain as a frozen conflict like for a very long time, or it could be renewed by EU or maybe some other nation states, in your perspective?
I think for the moment, a few things have become fairly clear. One is that on the front lines, as I said, they have not, with all the help that Ukraine has got from European military hardware, from American military hardware, from the training and the drones they've been able to use for a lot of their warfare, they've not been able to push Russia back to older previous fault lines and border lines. So that's one thing that's clear. The second, I think, what is becoming increasingly clear is that in terms of economics, Europe and the US may have taken a position, but the global south and a large part of the world is not going along with them. So right now, yes, India has reduced its intake of Russian oil. It might bring it down to a minimum because of American sanctions, but it's not because India wants to. It is because this has now become very complex and the sanctions have imposed costs on that oil. And if you extrapolate that to the entire global south, that continues to want to do business with Russia, is not willing to say every war means we have to take a side and follow these sanctions. That's, I think, the second thing that's becoming very obvious, that there is a third pole in that sense, that is saying, I don't necessarily approve of what Russia has done, but I'm not going to be a part of this kind of complete carving up of the world because it does not suit me. Also, the questions about Western hypocrisy and the idea that the West has done many of these actions in the past and not faced any consequences for it. And I think the third thing that is unfortunately becoming very, very clear is that the United Nations is in gridlock. And by gridlock, I mean, the UN Security Council has not been able to pass a single resolution on this issue. I mean, maybe a few technical resolutions, but in general, not a single resolution. Why? Because Russia is there. If any resolution is particularly critical of Russia, Russia will itself veto it. And you have a situation where the US is also waiting there to veto any resolution against Israel. China will veto certain other resolutions. In this situation where three of the five permanent Security Council members, and frankly, UK and France normally do go along with the Western kind of coalition, you have a situation where any one of them can veto all movement. So it's becoming very clear that the UN Security Council has no powers to move forward because they can't give the final, sort of orders or enforce those orders to end this war. So I think what you're actually seeing, and I know this is a very long answer to your basic question, which is what's going to happen next. What you're basically seeing is this will now be guided by events. If Russia continues to stay in position, keeps solidifying its control, and I've been speaking to journalists who've been on those border villages on the Russian side as well as the Ukrainian side, and the sense I get is that on the Russian side, many of the villages along this fault line, which is these areas that Russia now controls in Donetsk, in Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and all the rest, are being emptied out so as to create buffers. If that is the case, it's going to become even more difficult to, in fact, be able to change these lines, because once borders get solidified, we see it between India and Pakistan. You see this kind of conflict lines that then stay forever. You may find that remains. I think if there is any other event that overtakes this, and we've seen this happen, that the world's interest then moves away, then it's left to those powers to sort it out. And thirdly, if on the other hand, I mean, because I'm just giving you scenarios, I don't think Russia will back off in this scenario. But if on the other hand, its economy collapses in some way, shape, or form, they may have to think of different ways to end this conflict. At the moment, what seems the most likely, as I said, is this kind of frozen conflict.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for such a comprehensive answer. I think we've really driven us like to examine each scenarios of how this conflict could end, and I think that gives a very insightful and comprehensive view of the whole conflict altogether and its future trajectory. And you also mentioned about the UN Security Council and its gridlock, especially because of the veto powers that are there. And it does raise a question because we're seeing that President Trump's has been and its dominant initiatives with the newly Gaza board peace plan, because to many people it seems like a US-led alternative to these multilateral platforms, especially while US has stepped back from so many UN-led committees, processes. It's now creating its issue specific, and we obviously believe that it would also serve US's interest first. And within this fragmentation of the UN, we're seeing before this whole US-led initiatives and US backing out, there was a lot of debate and not even a lot of about a lot of discussion about India vouching for the UN security seat and the council seat. And now that it has somehow lost its relevance, we are seeing US-led alternatives. So, should India be joining them, or should India perhaps remain at a strategic distance from these US-led alternatives? And what could these like look like realistically in the future for India?
In a sense, Christine, the future is already here. So the fact is that this UN system that everybody now acknowledges is broken. Whether it is the UNSC, the UNGA, all of them are essentially ineffective in preserving the global peace, stopping the infringement of sovereignty that we are seeing around the world. So there's a global consensus. Just now, Brazilian President Lula was here, and before he left, he said very clearly in a press conference that this is not a workable UN. This is not representative, and it's not effective. So if you're neither representative nor effective, then why should the world sort of care? This is not the first time we're facing this. After all, there have been attempts at bringing global organizations together in the past centuries as well. In the 1800s, Lord Tennyson wrote this poem called The Parliament of Man. And he was looking at a kind of emancipation, not necessarily post colonial, but at least of colonial powers coming together. 100 years later, in the early 1900s, the League of Nations, that fell apart. Then the United Nations came around, and it's had a run, 80 years now. Before it hits a 100-year mark, you can be quite sure that it will either completely disintegrate or be renewed, in a sense, reimagined and restarted. Because this is not workable, as Mr. Lula said. You cannot have a UN Security Council, which has 5 permanent members, who essentially hark back to the World War of 100 years ago. So if they reflect a 100-year-old reality, how are they current? Apart from everything else, that there's nobody from Africa, there's no country from South America, and the most populous nation in the world, India, is just not there. It makes very little sense when the entire center of gravity of the world is moving towards Asia in terms of the economies, and you have two European powers, one American and then Russia and China. It just does not make sense that this should be, and nobody is signing on, in a sense, to this being the future of the United Nations either. So there has to be reform, there has to be change, it has to move in some direction. In that scenario, what is going to replace it? So you have many questions. One is, will it be, instead of one United Nations, you will have a fragmented number of multilateral organizations at work? You have the G20, you have the G7, you have the BRICS now, developing world coming up. There are 10, 11 countries that essentially are non-Western. The G7 is increasingly just a Western group since they cut Russia out. Or will you have something later this year? France is going to host a G7 with many of the BRICS members, certainly IBSA members over there. So is there some way of bringing some synergy between them? So that's one way. You go G1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and decide what combination you want to, in a sense, work on global governance. The second is the idea of, I don't know if you've heard of this, but it's called 50-50-50. That means 50 combinations of 50 different countries coming together on 50 different issues. So, for example, if you want to talk about critical minerals, there's one grouping that gets together and says, we want to work on a global governance format. If there's climate change, there's a different group of 50 countries coming together. And the third idea, which I don't think has many takers, but you're seeing them, is one of the global powers building a new system. So you referred to Mr. Trump with his kind of idea of the board of peace, and said essentially the UN has done nothing. My board of peace is going to fix the problem in Gaza, after which we will fix other problems. So there's this big concern that he's going to take an interest in other problems, including, since he keeps repeating it, the India-Pakistan conflict. At the same time, China is coming out with its own ideas of the Global Governance Initiative, Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, and it already has the Belt and Road Initiative. So you are seeing both the current Global 1 and 2 putting out their versions of what could be the new global governance model. And I think it remains to be seen how that happens. When you were asking what happens in the future, I think what we're seeing right now, there's a board of peace working on one thing, which the UN has somehow endorsed. On the other hand, there's a critical minerals group that's working on something else. There is, of course, the developing world that is coming up with alternative manners of mechanisms of payment. While they're not looking at a BRICS currency just yet, they're looking at intra-BRICS payment mechanisms. And look at the economies involved. There's Russia, there's China. I think there are four of the top 10 energy suppliers. There's UAE, there's, well, Saudi Arabia may or may not join, but there's Egypt, there's Indonesia. Apart from the five that founded, right at the beginning, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So we're seeing countries, there's Iran as well, we're seeing countries that are producing a very different version of what the global future will look like. So I think it remains to be seen how the new, whatever, in the old days, the saying used to be, if we didn't have a United Nations, we'd have to invent one. I think we certainly have to reinvent one.
Yes, that I feel is pretty true, ma'am, considering the global changes. And as we see these global groupings, every country have different sort of ambitions. Same goes for India. And I believe this ultimately reflects in their trade and technology front as well. On one hand, we see that India is clearly trying to diversify its economy, attract investment, and position itself completely in areas like AI, especially taking note of the current AI Impact Summit. On the other hand, it's also deepening cooperation with US led technology, frameworks, and partnership, especially since it's been part of Pax Silica order, where technological ecosystem, supply chain are becoming central to global power. Ma'am, how can India manage this balance, especially when strategic cooperation and economic autonomy, historically, as we've seen, do not always move in the same direction? Do closer India US trade, investment, and tech ties strengthen India in the long run, or could they eventually constrain its flexibility?
Well, I mean, the truth is, I hesitate to answer this question simply because we don't know what the US is going to say next. The truth is, even in the last few days, the fact that the US Supreme Court has struck down tariffs that the rest of the world actually accepted. I mean, I find that amazing. That a year ago, when Mr. Trump announced his tariffs, half the world said, we're not accepting this. Within a year, everybody, and this includes India, had signed on to trade deals, except for Russia and China. Everybody was engaged in doing trade deals with America, even if it sounded completely irrational and certainly unfair. Poor countries having to pay 18%, 20% tariffs on goods, or trying to compete in an export market with those. Um, so that was one, that the Supreme Court struck that down. Then Mr. Trump came back with 10%. Then he came back with 15%. We don't actually know where they'll stand. About a year ago, I had been asked exactly this question. And I remember at the time, and this was before the tariffs had been announced, Mr. Trump had only said he planned them. And to be fair, it is in what is called Mandate 2024. This paper that these tariffs would come. And he had consistently been saying that all these countries that we have deficits with, I'm coming at them with tariffs. And essentially, I proposed that there were three ways of dealing with it. You put up with it, you push back, or you just ride it out. In a sense, we all know that later this year in November, the US will go for midterm elections. And while that doesn't change Mr. Trump's position, if the Republicans lose the Senate in these elections, which is likely, which is possible, then it becomes much more difficult for Mr. Trump to do these unilateral actions that he's been doing. After all, right now he's able to do these unilateral actions, not just because the world is kind of so stunned and not pushing back enough, or not unionizing enough, not coming together and saying, okay, that's it. We're just not going to deal with what the US is doing right now. It's also because he controls a trifecta. He controls the US Senate. He controls the Congress. He has the judiciary in his favor, although some of his own judges or his appointed judges didn't vote in his favor in this case. And he has, he has complete control inside the White House, because the Republican Party is, there's no other faction apart from him. So the pushbacks in the American system are much less. But that could change come November. So your options are still, even today, to put up with what the US is doing, go along with it, push back, which comes at a price because then you will have to face American wrath, or just ride it out, wait, pull things out. And I think it is important that after all these new shocks that have come, the government has decided to hold off the next round of trade talks, because remember, they're supposed to go into trade talks this week in order to sign a trade agreement in March. Is that going to be possible given all the changes? It's hard to say. So when you ask about these US-led organizations, India has been part of the Quad. India has been part of what was in those days called the Mineral Security Partnership, MSP, which is now being called Pax Silica. India has been part of what was called ISET, now called Trust, which is technological, coming together with the US. India was a small part of some of the other American led coalitions, in terms of event development and all the rest. But right now, it seems difficult to see whether it can continue to sustain this kind of interest. We all know that the India-US relationship is important, but how long are you going to be able to sustain it if there is zero predictability? There is zero stability. You can sign a deal with the US today. Prime Minister Modi picked up the phone, called President Trump on February 2nd. They had a conversation. They discussed the trade deal. Within 2 hours of that, Mr. Trump had put out a social media post which the government in Delhi still has not accepted. So given this kind of unpredictability and complete lack of dependability on what the US is right now, I find it hard to say, what the future of these coalitions. After all, if you can't see even a month ahead whether a coalition will be important or not, it's hard to say. Tomorrow we may have the Quad Summit. On the other hand, we may go another year. We've already done 1 year without the Quad Summit. We may go another year without it. And where that leads. So not to confuse people watching in terms of saying nothing is predictable. What is predictable is what is happening in India, what's happening with its other relationships, what's happening in terms of India's own desire for a new multilateral framework. But I think the idea that at this particular moment India would pull itself into an alliance of any sort is unlikely.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your answer. And I truly believe that when you said about unpredictability, we've seen that in so many instances, especially the tariff war. And President Trump, like, I think I remember attending a talk when Mr. Trump was elected and for the second term. And when I had asked a question to the speaker, I think he had mentioned that one thing that we can know for sure that he's very unpredictable. We may not know what happens next. And we can see that also with his actions in West Asia because it's in a constant flux. There's so much to uncover there. There are tensions between Khamenei and Trump, and then Mr. Khamenei also he had briefly closed the Strait of Hormuz and limiting US's oil. And as well as the ongoing Gaza conflict. Then we have the peace boat, and I remember that when you were at JLF, you had mentioned the peace boat as more of like an investment venture because you were so skeptical of it, and it was so different than a traditional peace plan. And ma'am, where do you really think that this is going? Because if we know that if this is US led, then obviously US is going to extract all of its strategic interest from West Asia. And then it's saying that it might go or it might not, and it all depends on Khamenei. And then it is just so, it also gets very confusing for us also students who are trying to engage with this. And what is happening really here? Like it gets really confusing and to clear that out. Ma'am, what do you think about that?
Firstly, West Asia or the Middle East has always been very complex because there are so many different fault lines, whether it is the Sunni Shia axis, as it's called, whether it is the real inherent issues within the Gulf states. Now we're seeing UAE versus Saudi Arabia becoming a little more tense, whether it has been the Israel Palestine conflict that's really polarizing in the region, and whether it has been the Israel Iran conflict and what Israel continuously says is a proxy war by Iran, whether it was through the Hezbollah. Well, now, you have so many different fault lines. At the same time, you have Israel, and while Israel is bilaterally a very good friend of India's, at the multilateral level, Israel has literally broken every rule there is. We have a situation where the UN Secretary General is banned from visiting Israel. He can't get a visa. More than 100 UN officials were killed in Gaza. So we're not even talking about the rules that Israel broke during this war in Gaza. We're talking just about how it treated the rule body, if you like, the United Nations. It declared UNRWA just a terror organization. So I think the first part of looking at West Asia is that it is already a tinderbox and it has seen so many conflicts. The US has been involved in so many conflicts. It has so many bases in the region that the next conflict, which could be US Iran, is essentially could go any way because Iran has now said that if there is a conflict, if Iran is attacked, we will attack not only American assets, but all people hosting American assets. As far as we're concerned, we see them also as a threat to us. So you're seeing real brinkmanship between the two. It may lead nowhere. Um, how do you make sense then of what is happening over there, and what could happen next? The first is, I think you have to accept that the US is a force of destabilization. At the end of the day, when it comes to West Asia, the US is not looking to stabilize the situation. It has, on the one hand, completely backed Israel on all of its actions, not just the Gaza bombardment, but also the bombing of specific leaders, whether they were in Syria, whether they were in Iran, whether they were in Lebanon, the strikes on Yemen, the strikes on, in fact, I think the only time the US did not approve of what Israel did was the strikes in Qatar, because Qatar is, of course, hosts an American base and it's a big ally. So the first is that the US has not really helped with stability. And by this constant targeting of Iran and saying, oh, my armada is right there, I'm just about to bomb them, I'm just going to do this, also kept that particular pot boiling. The second is to recognize that there is a fault line that is not being bridged. Just think about how much has changed in just 2 years or 3 years. In 2023 September, just prior to the October 7th attacks, India was, hosting the G20, and we saw the coming about of the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, IMEC, as it's called. And the idea was that now West Asia was seeing a time of relative calm, relative stability, and relative unity. So that you had Abraham Accords, so the UAE and Israel established accords. You had the I2U2, where the US and India and UAE and Israel were working together. You had Jordan and Israel having certain agreements. You had the idea that Saudi Arabia could actually also establish ties with Israel. And that's what the connectivity corridor really based itself on, because we can keep saying we're connecting from India to Europe, but if the middle is not there, it can't hold. And the truth was that this is the direction India thought its future was going in. But today, post what has happened in Gaza, regardless of what happens with the reconstruction of Gaza, I think that trust factor, I think it is going to be very difficult for any government in the Gulf to establish really close ties with Israel without facing real pushback from their own streets. And so that scenario has completely changed. That instead of saying they want peace, they certainly don't want normalcy with Israel right now. So the first that I said is that the US is not a force for stability. The second is that the Gulf and Israel are not actually looking for better ties right now. They want, on both sides, Israel wants to see the Gulf backing its efforts for what it sees as an anti-terror war. The Gulf just is unable to see the kind of the humanitarian situation in Gaza. 70,000 civilians killed. 20,000 of them are children. I always ask this question, which is that if on October 7th, when the entire world, in a sense, was so shocked by what happened in Israel, everybody had said their condemnation. And Israel had support from everywhere, including, from people who had been enemies. And if at that moment you had the Israeli prime minister or the IDF saying, okay, I can resolve this issue, it'll just mean that I have to bomb 80% of the buildings in Gaza, and I have to make millions homeless, and I have to kill about 70,000 people, including 20,000 children. What would the world's reaction have been? It would have been, no, you can't do that. That's too high a cost to pay. Obviously, even one life is too high a cost to pay for some situations. But if this had been suggested at that time, people would have said no. And yet the world watched, and 2 years later, that's where we have reached. There is going to be some kind of repercussions of this, regardless of what you're seeing. So that's really the second point of focus. The third point of focus, I think, is important, which is that when the dust settles, there is a day after. There is a day after this scenario when it will be important for reconciliation. And I think it's important to start looking already at who are those players going to be, the players that are able to effect some kind of reconciliation. Prime Minister Modi is heading to Israel. Will India hold that position if it is seen as tilting one way or another is a question. Will it be Russia and China that hold that position? Will it be other powers that come around? And in the last few years, we've seen, Turkey, we've seen certain other South American players, Brazil and Mexico playing these kind of roles. So I think that's another place, the extra regional players, Indonesia, and what they are going to do next, because that is really going to be required, regardless of whether we can patch the UN together again. But we can. West Asia is just going to be a continuous tinderbox. You're looking at million plus new refugees being created. They will go somewhere. And if they can't go somewhere, there will be violent repercussions to whatever follows.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your answer. And ma'am, I think you just mentioned about Prime Minister Modi to Israel, and I was actually just coming upon India's strategy for that, because we've seen that now India is really trying to outreach its program, especially in West Asia. We're seeing that it is also trying to deepen its ties with Israel silently. It's also engaging with Palestine. And it also belatedly joined this UN statement which condoned the Israeli actions in Gaza. And then we also had the India Arab foreign ministers meet in Delhi. And so we're seeing that this engagement that India is having is increasingly become layered with its participation and outreach. But it is also telling us, it is hinting us that India is trying to play its cards right. It's trying to be deliberate. And a lot of times, experts do look at it as an oscillation that one side it's like, oh, Palestine, and then also condoning the actions, and at the same time, trying to have the ties and maintaining ties with Israel. Ma'am, a lot of times does it seem like as if this our long strategic interests become somehow lose their relevance in this game of trying to play our cards right? I know a lot of times people are advocates of this, and I am too. I say that yes, of course, India is trying to look at its strategic autonomy and trying to have that multipolarity agenda. But at the same time, this oscillation can somehow also create a lot of apprehension in experts. And I remember, I think it was Ambassador Shyam Saran who had some termed this, I remember, in a conference 2, 3 weeks ago. So I just wanted to know your views on that.
Well, there is a reason for that balance, and it's not new. Why does India need to balance its relations in West Asia? Why can't it just say, I'm with my friends, and I will stand with them no matter what. It's for several reasons. The first is India's historical partnerships in the region. The historical partnerships are with countries like Iran, which was India's neighbor until 1947. Historical partnerships with most of the Gulf countries, where trading used to happen with the UAE, with Yemen, with Saudi Arabia, with Kuwait over the centuries. So that's the historical partnership. The second is the trade that we do with these countries, which is, sometimes it's I think about a quarter of India's GDP. It's a quarter of India's global trade at one point. It's certainly substantial, whether it's 10, 15, 20%, it is substantial. The third is energy. At a time, particularly now, when India has already had to give up Iranian oil because of American sanctions. Venezuelan oil comes on and off. Now Russian oil. These are the energy sources. Iraq is Saudi, UAE. These are all Bahrain. These are all energy sources for India. Different petrochemical products as well. And the last is India's remittances, the millions of Indians. There are, I think, 10 million Indians living and working in this region. And they send back a large chunk of the remittances that India gets from around the world. This is also very important because the safety of those Indians then becomes a reason to continue that balance between both sides. And India has had a unique position. People allow India to take a position where they're not necessarily standing with one or the other. When the Israel Iran strikes happened last year and things were getting worse, there was only one country for which Iran basically announced a unilateral ceasefire, opened its airspace to allow a flight to take off, an Iranian flight to take off with Indian students and come back home. This is because of centuries and decades of this particular Indian position, which has been, there have been some principles to it. It's not completely just, it's only about India's interests. It has been about the idea that India is a force for good and is not looking to, insinuate itself into the conflict there. If that balance goes one way or the other, there will be repercussions for India as well. So you really don't want to change that balance at all. Sometimes it means essentially choosing between friends, but finding ways to do that. So more recently, the UAE president came to Delhi overnight, and India and the UAE announced that they will have some kind of a defense partnership. Obviously, that's not something Saudi Arabia is going to be very happy about. Or when Prime Minister Modi is in Israel, the question is going to be, has India abandoned Palestine? So it's a question of how you do manage these balances. I certainly think that we are looking at a scenario which is getting more and more fraught. And it's going to be much more difficult for India to make the point that it is only interested in being a force for good. At some point, someone is going to be disappointed, and then you'll see the repercussions of that. But it means that you just have to be very, very engaged in the region at all times. It's not an option for India, unlike maybe some countries, to say essentially, I will just not get involved.
Yes, ma'am, that's pretty true, I guess, because India is upholding a very strategic position right now, and we cannot go beyond without talking about its neighboring nations, especially Bangladesh, which has seen a significant political transition. You have spoken recently about the need for New Delhi to engage carefully with the new leadership under Tariq Rahman, and we saw that intent reflected in Om Birla attending the swearing-in ceremony. Yet at the same time, we have certain unresolved issues, particularly around Sheikh Hasina and extradition, which indeed add a layer of political sensitivity to it. How should India manage this transition to preserve stability in areas like security, border management, and connectivity, while also ensuring that Bangladesh does not drift strategically closer to China, in your opinion?
Well, in order to do all the things that you have just mentioned, the first most important thing is going to be keep the channels of communication open. I unfortunately find that in the last few years, while there is a lot of space, we just talked about India's balance with West Asia, dealing with Iran this way, dealing with Israel that way, dealing with Qatar and all the rest in a different way. There seems to be a lot of tolerance for that and a lot of understanding that India needs to do all of this. And yet, in the neighborhood, we have started taking very, very tough positions in terms of public discourse. As it is, we're living in a scenario where for 10 years we have no talks process with Pakistan. With Bangladesh, it looked like we were getting into that scenario once again, that there's no need to talk to them. We had a very unfortunate, according to me, and this is a personal opinion. There are many who have felt and told me quite honestly that they believe otherwise, but an unnecessary situation where we cancelled the contract of a Bangladeshi cricketer who had been signed on by an IPL team simply because minorities were being treated badly, we felt inside Bangladesh. And we need to think about whether that is how we are going to proceed forward. So the second part of what I'm saying is essentially that it's not just communication that is required, it is keeping at the forefront, in a sense, the relationship that actually binds us. And that's a relationship between two people who live across boundaries. They're contiguous in a sense. So that's the second, that the relationship with people has to be kept. We may not approve of the government somebody chooses or of the government somebody chooses to depose. We may actually want governments to accept certain constitutions, have human rights of the kind that we would like, but it is necessary to keep those in the balance with your relationship with the people, which has to be one of a certain amount of tolerance. And I think the third has to be an understanding. I have traveled to every one of India's neighbors, or to every SAARC country. And because there was a SAARC process, there was a South Asia process where the countries used to meet, and they were supposed to meet once every year or once every 2 years. And there were so many processes that went along with that we had an opportunity to go to each of these countries. That no longer exists. That's gone away, primarily because India refused to attend the SAARC summit in Pakistan until terrorism ends and all the rest of that. But in each of these countries, there's a huge reservoir of goodwill for India. It is also true, and maybe people will not want to say it, and certainly not anymore, that India was seen as the exemplar. That even if the neighboring countries had military regimes or problems with for minorities and all the rest of it, that India represented a certain good example in the region, and that it was a stakeholder in its region's success. That seems to have frayed somewhat. And if you want to be the exemplar, then you have to also show that you follow those rules. You cannot tell another country have a constitution or have laws that are completely secular and completely egalitarian if you are not doing it yourself. You can't tell another country, especially in the neighborhood, because they're watching us very closely, treat your minorities better unless you yourself don't have discrimination and brutalization of minorities in your own country. So this kind of double standard does not work. So I think that's certainly the third problem. The fourth has been an idea that no matter who comes to power in our neighboring countries, India is going to have to engage with them. Unfortunately, the impression got built, and this is now not just about Bangladesh. This is about, for example, in Nepal, with one particular government, Sri Lanka, in Maldives, where it began to look like India was taking sides with one political dispensation over another. And I think, the government has pulled back from that kind of, and even, as you pointed out, the outreach to the new Bangladesh government is proof that the government is rethinking some of this. But if you remember the social media commentary on the Maldives, for example, a few years ago, we don't like this leader, so therefore we should cut off ties, boycott, no tourism and all that. That kind of idea that we are in some way only going to deal with a government that we like, that has a huge repercussion in the neighborhood. In fact, causes a backlash. And Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina did suffer from that backlash. She had her own problems in her own country. But one of the real problems was that then she was seen as India's person in the country. And when she came to India, then that idea has kind of got solidified. So that is, you're quite right, another issue that will have to be resolved at one point. If you were to ask me what exactly happens with Sheikh Hasina in India when there is this warrant out for her, when there are all these death sentences against her in Bangladesh, I would just say very simply that I don't believe that any Indian government can treat a guest who is here as a guest, and the government says she is an honored guest, in any way other than how she chooses. So if she were to return to Bangladesh, that would be at her own choice. And it doesn't matter what the cost is, because India has shown in the past, India has been home to so many others, refugees, the Dalai Lama, the Tibetan community, refugees from different parts of the world, and historically refugees from so many different religions who have come and lived within India, that I don't think that is necessarily going to happen. But I do think that there are ways of keeping communications open so that your neighbors feel that you, A, understand their concerns and are willing to treat them as equals.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your answer. Ma'am, I truly do agree with the point that we've always had a policy, like I think this is also statement Atiti Devo Bhava, that it's an Indian value, it's an Indian tradition that we're supposed to treat guests with respect. And it has all surely caused issues in the past before as well, since you mentioned about the Dalai Lama when he came here, and then the tensions between India and China had definitely escalated. And I'm definitely mentioning about China. It's obviously we definitely have to have a question in this podcast about China. And there has also been a development in that, because we've seen in the United States national security strategy that they have changed their tone with its engagement with China to somewhat, like, as some people go, to be respectful. And this seems to be like a change that is to be noted from a strategic lens as well, because we've seen that US, definitely Washington has its own priorities. It wants to be a hegemon in the Western Hemisphere, and then perhaps then afterwards checkmate on China. At the same time, China also, of course, has its ambitions, its expansionist ambitions to be a hegemon in Asia. And while these two countries are trying to fight for primacy, we as a nation, we're obviously trying to balance and we're trying to diversify, and we have other engagement forums as well to do that. But at the same time, for many things, for example, technology, we see China still so much ahead of us. And while we are also not far ahead, far behind China, but at the same time, we still have a lot of, I would say, dependency on trade, on a lot of factors, and this can somehow complicate our stances as well. And ma'am, I wanted to know your opinion on that, and especially how we've known that our ties with China have definitely improved as compared to before, but it definitely does create a question. So, ma'am, how what do you think of that?
I think, firstly, you mentioned the US NSS strategy. The US and its relationship with China is in a sense its own trajectory. If India is sitting around waiting for the US to have one policy or another over China, that will be a mistake, because, like everything else, the US will change. So, the new NSS policy that doesn't mention China as a challenge, doesn't mention China as a threat, has, as you said, this more respectful language, represents a shift, but who knows how long that shift goes on. I think between India and China, look, firstly, there are centuries of basically no conflict. Some of that is because India's neighbor was Tibet, and not China directly. But the truth is that there are huge historical connections between India and China, apart from the fact that we are Asia's two biggest powers. So there's a certain responsibility that goes along with that. Where the challenges come are threefold for India. One, it's a line of actual control. It's an unresolved boundary, but it's more than 3,000 kilometers. It's 3,000, I think, 400 kilometers. And at that boundary now, especially after 2020 and all that happened, has to be manned the entire time. In a sense, our entire military budget the resources needed to man that long boundary is essentially a problem. The second is what China is doing in the maritime sphere, which is perhaps not as the same level of threat for India as the continental threat is. But even there, India is part of the Quad, for example, or is working with other countries on Indo-Pacific strategies, essentially to ensure that these waterways remain open, that Chinese ships and submarines don't try to dominate any of these and keep the sea lanes open. The third is India's neighborhood. And Pakistan is one part of the problem because if you look at India's continental challenges, 3,000 kilometers on this side, 2,000 something kilometers on this side, you're looking at two vital continental boundaries for India, which are with adversaries. And frequently we hear from the military chiefs that they actually operate as one. So this is a huge challenge for India. Then you look at the other neighbors, and you mentioned Bangladesh earlier. The fact is that if you were to look at figures from 2008 for aid, trade, investment, tourists, and students, right? Uh, in each of our neighboring countries, maybe minus Bhutan and China, you would see that the pendulum has swung. There are more students going from each of our neighbors to China to study. There are more tourists coming from China to each of our neighbors than before, and in many cases, more than Indians. Is more aid, trade, and investment coming from China to each of the neighbors. So obviously, there is going to be a concern for India, and very popularly, it's called the string of pearls idea that China is producing a choke chain around India. But even if it isn't exactly, able to do that, because India has its own relations in the neighborhood, which are historical, the fact is it is a frontier. Now, within that, you have to deal with the bilateral relationship. So these are the three challenges, and you have a bilateral relationship. You have trade, you have this massive deficit, in fact, 100, I think of 140, I shouldn't get into figures here, but $100 billion in deficit with China means that India consistently needs to import things from China and is not able to find things that they can sell or that China will allow India to sell back. That's one part. There's the core dependencies. You mentioned some of them, supply chains for critical minerals, your solar power batteries, your advanced pharmaceutical ingredients. That seems like, just chemicals, but at the end of the day, if you don't get those APIs, India cannot be the pharmacy to the world. You deal with the sort of bilateral relationship when it comes to all the various parts of it. India is with China in an organization like BRICS and the SCO, which is really seen as a China-led organization. India works with China on a number of other multilateral areas. So it's a complex relationship that has to be navigated at all times. And I don't think it helps to bring in the US question into that. I do think, and this is a postscript, that the situation between India and China at the line of actual control in 2020 has not gone away. As long as the line of actual control is not resolved, both sides don't agree that it's an international boundary, this can happen again. There is no question that what China did in terms of the destabilization of the line, the amassing of troops, the crossing over of troops in 2020 has ensured that all agreements with China on the border have now been shelved, more or less. You have to build a new compact with China. And I think that's what the process of what you're saying is happening right now, is that search for, can we find new trust levels? Can we agree with each other on certain issues?
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your answer. We just have two questions left before we wrap up the podcast. And this last question would somehow conclude the whole the nexus then the whole situation and everything that we've discussed, and the last would be on Gen Z and geopolitics. And my question is to you for why I said about US and the China nexus. It was because of the Indo-Pacific and the Quad, because we've seen that when Quad was very active and then the Quad summits when they were going on, many experts noted it as a way of countering China and China's moves. And especially we've seen a lot of assertiveness in South China Sea, and a lot of their strategies, especially Chinese maritime strategies, can also be seen in IOR, their tactics especially. And now that Washington has sometimes it has been selective in its Indo-Pacific commitments, and you mentioned the Quad summit did not happen even last year. I can sense that it has created some space for India, but can do you think India can take the lead in these? And because the Indian Ocean and Indo-Pacific it's a very strategic pillar in this region, and it can definitely work something to consolidate its strategic autonomy as a rising power player in this region as well, without overcommitting to any access as it has been.
Well, essentially, for India, I keep saying strategic autonomy is not a choice. That is bred into India philosophically, if you like. But I think also just in terms of geography, and I say this, and I think I said this at Jaipur again, that Napoleon once said, "Show me a country's geography, I'll tell you its foreign policy. I'll tell you its history as well." And that is because we are defined by our geography. I talked about the continental challenges India has. If you were to look within, go further into our continental depth, and go country after country, whether it's China, Mongolia, Central Asia, Iran, all the way up to Russia, all the countries that you will find are essentially in the non-Western bracket. They're either anti-Western or certainly not in the Western construct or Western alliance. When you look at the oceans, it's a different reality, as I pointed out just now. If you've got these kind of conflicting realities, pulling for your resources, what is it that you can do? Certainly, you cannot get into an alliance with one person or the other. You will be a strategically autonomous country because you have very little choice. I think the second part of that is India did not give up did not push out its colonial past in order to become part of somebody else's grouping, in a sense, a junior partner to some other alliance. If India has the ability to say, I am both a friend of this side and that side, in a sense, both the West and the non West, the global North, the global South, the developing world, the developed world. Within West Asia, we mentioned that, where all India has its balance. If that is going to be India's stock in trade, then the only way it can continue to be that is if it actually has strategic autonomy. The third part, and that relates to, in a sense, the UN institutions, because India has been a beneficiary of the multilateral rules-based order. It has given India the space to grow its economy, while also ensuring that, I always point out that the fact is, for India, what is our USP? India's USP is not so much about the size or of course, it's unique, the number of people now, it's the highest population. But at the end of the day, it is because India, for its size, has remained a democracy, has remained a pluralistic, inclusive, and dare I say, secular democracy, which is a rule abiding country, which is seen as a part of the rules based order. If these are your USPs, then each of those will have some kind of pushback if you join one or the other camp. So it's important to stay somewhere in the middle. I don't know if that really answers your question, but I think it's necessary to remember that India is not here by accident. It is not seen as a rising power, one which has so many different countries as not as stakeholders necessarily, but certainly having a lot of goodwill for India. And you see it around the world. I'm sure, in my lifetime, I have traveled to so many parts of the world and always felt the kind of historical goodwill for India that has always been there. And that comes from this sense that India does stand alone. It doesn't always grow the fastest. It doesn't always do the best. And the last point I will say is that we have to move from a country that focuses on GDP as a factor of international power. And you pointed out that India and China, the comparisons, China's economy is 5 times India's. But India's position in the world, one wouldn't say that China was 5 times more important. You'd say, okay, a little India and China are seen in many factors, in much more closer terms. And that's because we have to move away from looking at GDP alone to GDP per capita. Until we are able to change internally the equation where the GDP per capita for an Indian citizen is puts India in the 120th positions. Instead of looking purely at by size and being one of the top 3 or top 5 countries, you will consistently need to focus on internal development. And that is where a lot of India's resources will go. If that is the case, then India needs all the friends it can get. Which is why I genuinely think that strategic autonomy is not a choice. It is the only way and the only option for India.
Thank you, ma'am, for your answer. Coming to the very last question, which I feel cannot be ignored, we have this increasing aspect of global conversation amongst the Gen Z. We are seeing a generation that is far more vocal, far more online, and far more globally aware than before. Whether it's climate change, wars, human rights, or even India's position on the world stage, young people are not just consuming information, they are reacting to it, debating it, and sometimes this even led to shaping narratives. And as we know that Gen Z tends to look at global issues in very clear moral terms, which is somewhat conflicted with the followed or perceived diplomatic structures. So, do you see this as something which can strengthen democratic debate, or does it sometimes make the complex international systems way too simpler than they really are?
Well, I think um, it is going to always be a complex choice. I don't think that any answers that I give you today are necessarily the answers that you will get tomorrow when it comes to India's foreign policy. But what remains consistent, and this is why I do urge you to go back and find the speech by Pandit Nehru that spoke about what independent India's foreign policy would be, because all of those principles still remain. Perhaps the idea of anti colonialism or anti racism is not as required now, it's much more about anti discrimination. But some of the other points, no joining of any big power blocks, a friendship towards all, to be the voice for the voiceless. When we speak about India being the voice of the global South, we are saying we want to be the voice for the voiceless. That's not a responsibility you can have easily. Whether it is the idea of India being part of all multilateral organizations, trying to be a part of a greater global framework. And in fact, I have to say, it talks in terms of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam way back in 1946 or 47, I think, there was this, I think 1946 when that statement was made. So if those are your tenets and you are seeing threads of those even today, 75, 80 years later, then clearly there is a principle of India's foreign policy that India has consistently followed. And if you look at it that way, I don't think that there is a confusion.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your answer. And I think it's time that we wrap our podcast. We will be proceeding with the closing remarks and the vote of thanks. And with that, we would like to extend our sincere thanks to Ms. Suhasini Haidar for a conversation that has been truly both wide ranging and deeply insightful. Over the course of this discussion, we've engaged with some of the most pressing issues shaping the global landscape today, from ongoing conflicts, shifting geopolitical alignments, escalations, building robust partnerships, India's values in the multi-aligned, multipolar world order, and the democratic values and the responsibilities that come with these.
Yes, in many ways, these are complex and often uncomfortable conversations, but they are essential ones, particularly at a time when global politics is increasingly interconnected and yet uncertain. Thank you so much, ma'am, for bringing clarity, context, and nuance to these discussions and for helping us move beyond headlines to better understand the deeper realities at play. It has truly been a privilege for both of us to engage with you in this conversation. Once again, thank you so much, ma'am, for sharing your time and your insights with us.
Ma'am, can we
Thank
have a group photograph before we leave? Yeah. Okay.